I was standing in my aunt's living room, the air thick with the smell of roasted turkey and polished wood, when I felt myself shrink under a smile that wasn't meant to be kind. Laughter bounced off the walls, silverware clinked, and I realized I was being dismissed again, right there in plain sight, like I hadn't earned my place in that room. My hands were steady, but my chest wasn't. If you've ever been quietly disrespected by the people who should know you best, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because moments like this are more common than we admit. I remember staring at the framed family photos, wondering how I'd become the background character in my own life. No one saw the years I'd spent rebuilding, the nights I'd pushed through doubt alone. They only saw what they wanted to see. I didn't know it yet, but that small moment of humiliation was about to crack something open, and once it did, nothing stayed hidden for long. I was standing in my daughter's living room with a paper plate balanced in my hands when I felt it again, that familiar tightening in my chest that comes when I realize I'm being talked down to. The house was full, holiday music humming, relatives drifting from couch to kitchen, and yet somehow the attention narrowed onto me in a way that made me feel small. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It never is. It was the casual dismissal, the amused tone, the way my efforts were treated like a harmless little pastime instead of something real. I smiled because that's what I've learned to do. I nodded. Inside, though, something sank. It hurt more because it came from my own family, the people who should have known me best. I remember looking at the decorations on the wall and focusing on my breathing, reminding myself to stay calm. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct anyone. Years ago, I learned that explaining myself to people who have already decided who you are is a losing game. What none of them could see was how carefully I was holding my composure, or how much restraint it took not to react. They assumed silence meant agreement, or maybe weakness. I let them believe that, at least for the moment, because as I stood there, listening and waiting, I knew something they didn't, a quiet certainty that the moment wasn't finished yet, and that this room was seconds away from changing everything. When the interruption came, it wasn't dramatic at first. The television in the corner shifted from background noise to something sharper, and I felt the room lean without anyone moving. I looked up more out of habit than curiosity, still holding my plate, still playing the part everyone expected. Then I recognized myself, not the version they thought they knew, but the one I'd been living quietly for years. My face on the screen, my work summarized with an ease that stunned me. For a brief second, my mind went blank, like my body needed time to catch up with reality. The room went still. Conversations dissolved into nothing. I could feel eyes turning toward me, not in mockery now, but in confusion. I didn't look back right away. I watched the screen, listened, let the moment land. What surprised me most wasn't the exposure of my success. It was how calm I felt once it was no longer hidden. The tension I'd been carrying loosened. I realized I had nothing to prove. The truth was already doing the work for me. Years of small dismissals flickered through my thoughts. The jokes, the advice I never asked for, the quiet assumption that my life was smaller than theirs. All of it seemed suddenly outdated, like news from another era. When I finally turned toward the room, I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The silence spoke with more authority than I ever could. In that quiet, something shifted. I wasn't standing on the edge anymore. I was centered, grounded, seen. And as the moment stretched, I understood this wasn't an ending. It was an opening, one that would finally allow me to tell the story of how I got here, on my own terms, without apology or explanation needed. When I think back to how I got here, It doesn't start with applause or encouragement. It starts with loss. A job that ended earlier than I expected, a routine that disappeared overnight, and a quiet fear I carried alone once the house went still. I didn't announce it to anyone. I didn't ask for advice. I just sat at my kitchen table and tried to figure out what came next. I began small, almost embarrassingly small. Late nights reading, watching tutorials, taking notes I wasn't sure would ever matter. I tried things that didn't work. I spent weeks on ideas that went nowhere. There were moments I felt foolish for even trying, but quitting felt worse than failing. Progress didn't arrive in big leaps. It showed up as tiny wins. One person signing up, one email saying something I shared helped, a few dollars earned that proved the effort wasn't imaginary. I kept going, not because I was confident, but because consistency felt like the only thing I could control. I didn't tell my family, and that wasn't an accident. Every time I thought about sharing, I remembered the past reactions, the polite smiles, the subtle jokes, the well-meaning doubts. I realized I didn't need that weight while I was still learning to stand on my own. So I stayed quiet. I worked early mornings and late evenings. I learned skills I never thought I would need. I adjusted when things broke. I showed up even when no one was watching. Over time, the work became stable, then sustainable, then something I could rely on. Not overnight, not magically, just slowly, built piece by piece. By the time anyone noticed, the foundation was already there. I hadn't hidden my journey out of secrecy. I had protected it until it was strong enough to speak for itself. Standing in that living room later, I understood why the silence mattered so much, because the work had given me something steady, and I could finally watch others adjust, realizing their view of me was about to change without me saying anything. In the days after that gathering, something shifted, and it wasn't subtle. My phone buzzed more than usual. Messages arrived that carried a new tone, softer, warmer, threaded with curiosity that hadn't existed before. People who rarely checked in suddenly wanted to know how I was feeling, whether I was tired, whether I was managing everything okay. At first, I tried to accept it at face value. I told myself this was care, maybe even pride. But as the attention continued, a quiet discomfort settled in. The questions circled the same themes: how busy I must be, how much responsibility I was carrying, how impressive it all sounded. None of it reached back to who I'd been before that night. I couldn't ignore the contrast. Not long ago, my time had been treated as flexible, my efforts as optional. Now there was urgency, a carefulness in how people spoke to me, as if I had become someone they needed to handle correctly. The respect felt real, but it also felt conditional, like it had arrived attached to a number or a title rather than a relationship. That realization stung more than the earlier dismissal. It forced me to sit with an uncomfortable truth. Approval hadn't come because they finally understood me. It came because my value was suddenly visible in a way they recognized. I noticed how often I was being asked to explain myself now, to share plans, to offer opinions that had once been brushed aside. And instead of feeling flattered, I felt guarded. Something in me tightened, not with anger, but with clarity. I began to understand that if I leaned into this attention, I'd be trading one kind of invisibility for another. I would be seen, but only as long as I remained useful. So I made a quiet decision. I would not chase this version of respect. I would observe it, learn from it, and protect the boundaries that had kept me steady. Because I could sense what was coming next, the moment when interest would turn into expectation, and I needed to be ready for that test. The request didn't come dramatically. It arrived the way these things usually do, wrapped in concern and necessity, softened by careful phrasing. I felt it before I fully understood it. that familiar pull in my chest, the instinct to step in and fix what someone else couldn't manage. The timing wasn't lost on me. Just weeks earlier, my choices had been dismissed as impractical, even naive. Now those same choices had quietly rebranded me as capable, even reliable. I sat with that irony longer than I expected to, letting it settle instead of pushing it away. Memories surfaced without invitation. The offhand comments about being unrealistic, the subtle suggestions that I should play it safe, stay small, not aim so high. Back then, my struggles were invisible. Now the need was urgent. And suddenly, I was being seen as the solution. I won't pretend the decision was easy. Compassion tugged hard. This was my family, after all. I understood stress, uncertainty, fear. I knew what it felt like to stare at a problem and not see a clear way out. Saying no outright felt cruel. Saying yes without thought felt dangerous. What I was really weighing wasn't money. It was meaning. I asked myself what kind of help would actually help. Whether stepping in fully would solve anything or simply delay the same patterns from repeating. I could feel frustration rising, but beneath it was something steadier, a sense that this moment mattered more than it appeared. I realized that helping didn't have to mean rescuing. Support didn't have to come at the cost of my own stability. I could be compassionate without erasing the boundaries I had worked so hard to build. So I made a choice that surprised even me. I would help, but deliberately, thoughtfully, on my terms, not out of guilt or pressure, but because it aligned with who I had become. As I held that line internally, I understood this wasn't just a test of generosity. It was a test of whether I could finally stand by myself, even while offering a hand. I spent a long evening thinking about what help should actually look like, not the kind that swoops in and erases consequences, but the kind that steadies someone long enough to let them stand on their own. I knew if I didn't define that clearly, old patterns would rush back in. My boundaries came from a simple place. Fairness mattered. Growth mattered. Accountability mattered. I wasn't willing to give support that allowed the same habits to continue unchecked. Help had to move things forward, not freeze them in place. That decision stirred up guilt I hadn't expected. There's a deep instinct, especially as a mother, to protect, to soften every fall. I felt that pull strongly. It would have been easier to give more, to say yes without conditions, to quiet the discomfort by overextending myself, but I also knew what unlimited help would do. It would postpone hard choices. It would teach dependence instead of resilience. And eventually, it would leave all of us frustrated and resentful, even if no one said it out loud. So I chose clarity over comfort. I offered help that was specific and time-limited, support that addressed immediate needs while insisting on effort and responsibility on the other side. It wasn't about control, it was about respect, for them and for myself. There was a moment after I made that decision when I sat alone and let the weight of it settle. My heart was steady, even if it wasn't light. I reminded myself that boundaries aren't walls, they're guideposts. By holding firm, I wasn't withdrawing love, I was redefining it. And as uneasy as it felt, I trusted that this was the kind of care that would reveal what happened next, without forcing answers before time and effort had done their work. I didn't hear much at first. Days passed, then weeks, and the space I'd created stayed quiet. That silence was uncomfortable, but it was also intentional. I reminded myself that stepping back was part of the promise I'd made to myself. From a distance, I began to notice signs of strain. Schedules tightened, plans changed. There was less ease in the way things were handled. I could sense the stress without being pulled into it, and that distance was new for all of us. What surprised me was not the struggle itself, but how they responded to it. Instead of immediately looking outward for solutions, they started adjusting inward. I noticed more careful decisions, smaller purchases, longer conversations about priorities. None of it was dramatic, but it was real. There were moments when I felt the urge to step in again, to smooth things over the way I always had. Watching people you love struggle is never comfortable, but I also saw something else forming underneath the discomfort. A kind of humility, a willingness to do things differently. Responsibility began showing up in quiet ways. Effort replaced assumption. They asked fewer questions meant to transfer the burden and more questions meant to understand it. The change wasn't consistent, and it wasn't clean, but it was happening. Emotionally. I stayed balanced on a thin line. Part of me worried, part of me hoped, and part of me recognized that this was exactly what growth looks like from the outside. Uneven, slow, sometimes discouraging. I didn't know how it would end, or whether the progress would hold. But for the first time, I could see movement that didn't depend on me fixing everything. That realization settled in gently, bringing cautious optimism just before everything was about to change again for all involved. When the call came, I knew immediately something was wrong. It wasn't the tone, it was the timing. Early morning, before the day had found its shape, before anyone calls without a reason. Fear moved faster than thought. My chest tightened as details blurred together, and suddenly all the distance I'd carefully maintained disappeared. This wasn't about money, pride, or lessons anymore. This was real. Someone I loved was in danger, and everything else fell silent. I didn't pause to weigh boundaries or principles. I grabbed my keys and drove, my mind narrowing to what mattered most. The frustration I'd been carrying dissolved without effort. In moments like that, resentment has no place to stand. As the reality settled in, I understood how different this was from everything before. This wasn't discomfort or poor planning or consequences unfolding slowly. This was a crisis that demanded presence, advocacy, and clarity. The kind of help required now couldn't be measured or negotiated. I felt fear, but I also felt something steadier underneath it, a sense of purpose that surprised me with its calm. I knew where I needed to be, who I needed to speak for, and what I needed to protect. There was no hesitation, only focus. In that moment, I wasn't the person who had been underestimated or the one learning to hold boundaries. I was simply family, fully present, fully engaged, ready to do whatever was necessary without keeping score. As hours passed, uncertainty hung heavy in the air. Decisions loomed, outcomes unclear, the path forward fragile and shifting. I stayed close, listening, watching, prepared to act again if needed. Nothing about this felt fair or earned or instructional. It was just life, demanding something deeper than resources or restraint. And as the situation unfolded, I knew this was where everything I had learned would finally be tested, not in theory, but in real time, with no guarantees and no room to look away. I understood then that love sometimes requires stepping forward without armor, accepting risk, and choosing responsibility even when the outcome remains frighteningly uncertain for everyone. I stepped into the situation fully, not as a fixer throwing money at fear, but as an advocate who could think clearly. I asked the right questions, gathered information, and made sure nothing important slipped through the cracks. When confusion spread, I slowed things down and focused on next steps. Experience mattered here. The years of building things on my own had taught me how to assess risk, prioritize decisions, and stay steady when emotions ran high. I wasn't louder than anyone else. I was calmer. That made a difference. I stayed close, not hovering, but present, I tracked updates, coordinated schedules, and made sure everyone had what they needed to get through the day. Support became practical and emotional at the same time, rooted in care rather than control. What surprised me was how trust returned without being requested. People looked to me for clarity, not because of titles or past success, but because I showed up prepared. Respect didn't need to be negotiated. It was built through action, moment by moment. In quieter moments, I felt the weight of responsibility and the depth of love underneath it. This was the kind of help that had always mattered to me, the kind that protects when someone is truly vulnerable. By the time things stabilized, there was a sense of direction again, not certainty, but movement. I knew the crisis wasn't over, yet we were no longer reacting blindly. We were moving forward together, with clearer roles and steadier ground. Time passed after the crisis, not in sweeping changes, but in quieter adjustments. Life settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by what we had all just lived through. The urgency faded, leaving behind habits that didn't disappear when things got easier. I noticed the differences in small ways. Conversations slowed down. Decisions were explained instead of assumed. When help was needed, it was asked for with clarity and followed by effort. No one pretended everything was fixed, and that honesty mattered more than any apology. The boundaries I had set didn't vanish. They softened at the edges, but they stayed visible. I was no longer expected to absorb every problem or anticipate every need. Responsibility began landing where it belonged, even when it was uncomfortable. Trust rebuilt itself quietly, not through promises or dramatic moments, but through consistency. People showed up when they said they would. They followed through. They adjusted when something didn't work. I did the same. We were still imperfect. Old habits surfaced now and then. I still had to remind myself not to overstep, and others had to catch themselves before slipping back into old expectations. Growth didn't erase history, but it changed how we carried it. What I took from all of this was simple. Real change doesn't arrive as a miracle. It earns its place through time, accountability, and shared effort. Standing where we are now, I feel steady. Not triumphant, just grounded, and ready to move forward with clearer eyes and hearts. This experience changed how I understand my own worth. I used to believe respect came from proving myself, from being useful enough to earn a place. What I learned instead is that self-respect has to come first, quietly and consistently, long before anyone else notices. Boundaries didn't distance me from the people I love. They showed me who was willing to grow with me and who needed time to catch up. They taught me that helping isn't about fixing everything, and love isn't measured by how much you give up. If there's one lesson I'm carrying forward, it's this. You don't need to wait for permission to take yourself seriously. You're allowed to grow privately. You're allowed to say no. And you're allowed to show up fully when it truly matters. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Sharing it wasn't easy, but it feels meaningful knowing it might help someone else feel less alone. If any part of this resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your story. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family or learn your own value the hard way? Leave a comment and share what that moment taught you.